First up, we have Fred MacVaugh, who is a historian by training and the former museum curator at the Fort Union Trading Post National Historic Site. He currently works at Fort Laramie National Historic Site in southeastern Wyoming, where he serves as the park's cultural resources program manager. He earned a master's degree in history from the University of Texas at El Paso and a master's of fine arts and creative writing and the environment from Iowa State University. Let's welcome him.
Setting my own stopwatch because invariably I talk longer than I need to because I go down way too many rabbit holes and tangents. So thank you. I'm glad to be here today. I do work for the Park Service. I just want to caveat this that I'm not here officially. I am on my vacation doing this for various reasons. Fort Union is a place that I did spend about 10 years from 2013 to 2022. I worked as the museum curator. And during that time, I really came to appreciate the history of the Upper Missouri. And when I went to Fort Union, I really knew nothing about the place other than it was a fur trade post. And so for me, in many ways, why Fort Union is really nationally significant is the story of my own personal discovery, as well as while there learning about aspects of the history of Fort Union that we really don't talk about or don't recognize or little recognize. The title, Smoke in the Mirrors, Why Fort Union is Nationally Significant, also reflects the fact that there's some updates that were made to a national landmark nomination for this site, and there's a updated National Register nomination, which I'll be pulling information from. Before I start, though, Fort Union shown here in the middle of this picture. This picture is a painting actually done by George Catlin, a Philadelphia lawyer turned artist back in the early 1800s. George Catlin comes up the Missouri in 1832 on the first steamship that pioneers the route from St. Louis up to the confluence. And then within a couple of decades, as most of you probably know, eventually steamships make it all the way to Fort Benton. Fort Union was established in 1828 by the American Fur Company. It operated until 1867, making it the longest operating trading post on the Upper Missouri, 39 years. I'll do a little sidebar here too. Interest in preserving Fort Union as a site began in the early 1900s. The site is first recognized by the Department of the Interior as a National Historic Landmark in 1961, and it's only about 10 acres. It's literally the site of the fort that's initially recognized. It's established by Congress as a park site in 1966, entered onto the National Register at that time. And I'll kind of leave it at that. So this map, which is produced by the Park Service, sort of shows not only the location of Fort Union, presently on the boundary of Montana and North Dakota. In fact, about 2/3 of the park are in North Dakota, 1/3 is in Montana. What's illustrated here, though, is not just the native nations that the trade engaged out of Fort Union. And you've got quite a few: Cree, Assiniboine, Blackfeet, Crow, Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, Lakota, and also Chippewa. It's also showing the sort of the sphere of influence out of Fort Union, or Fort Union's sphere of influence. Underneath the American Fur Company, again, which did initially own and operate Fort Union, eventually turns over to the Chateaus out of St. Louis, and they operated into the early Civil War period, and then the last few years operated by some smaller companies. Like many companies today, though, the American Fur Company was huge. It had regional subdivisions, and the Upper Missouri outfit, which emerged actually from a competitor, the Columbia Fur Company, that the American Fur Company buys out and absorbs. The Upper Missouri outfit, headed by a gentleman originally from the Canadian fur trade, Kenneth Mackenzie, he operates out of Fort Union. And so Fort Union is sort of like a regional headquarters for the American Fur Company. And the sphere of influence that they have out of Fort Union really encompasses quite a large area. Now, I didn't necessarily know that when I got to Fort Union in 2013. I didn't doubt that it was nationally significant. You know, it's a national park site, so I just took it for granted. Nevertheless, all I really knew was it was a fur trade post. Somebody else from the Philadelphia area or with Philadelphia connections had been there. And I grew up in southeast Pennsylvania in the Philadelphia area. Didn't have any roots in the Northern Plains, so I gravitated naturally to connections I could make to home. So James Audubon spent 2.5 months up at Fort Union. So I found that really exciting. It was a national park site. And then I also knew that the present fort you can see today is a reconstruction. Now, why did I have doubts potentially about the national significance of the fort? Well, I was aware that there was a congressional study done that looked at national park units and questioned the national significance of many national park sites, smaller sites. And Fort Union as a reconstruction, there was perhaps reason to think that it wasn't accurate and had been a boondoggle. So I had reasons to doubt. But I started with what I knew. And again, what I knew was this gentleman, John James Audubon, had come to the Upper Missouri in 1843. So I wanted to figure out what he was doing. And actually, Audubon, as you're all well aware, justly famous for, by 1843, producing the first 6 volumes of the Birds of America. The 7th volume actually comes out after his trip to the Upper Missouri. Why he comes to the Upper Missouri, though, is not to necessarily finish Birds of America, but to develop a companion encyclopedic work on what he called the viviparous quadrupeds, or the 4-footed critters that give live births. So documenting mammals in the middle of the United States. That's what drew him up here. Now, unfortunately, he passed away before the project was completed, but his partner in crime actually completed the 3 volumes, as did with contributions from his sons. Learning about or knowing about Audubon, naturally, I make the connection with Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, as you all well know, did not exist yet when Audubon was here in 1843. Roosevelt's not born until 1858, so 15 years later, give or take a couple of months. But Theodore Roosevelt did want to, as a child, to be a naturalist like Audubon. He was sickly as a child. He found communion with nature. He observed nature. It wasn't until he actually is an undergraduate that he decides, being a naturalist may not be the career choice for me. Nevertheless, there is a connection, maybe somewhat tenuous, between Roosevelt and Fort Union, and it comes from this gentleman. This gentleman pictured here is named John Graham Bell, and as far as I could ever determine, he's no relation to Alexander Graham Bell. John Graham Bell, though, was the taxidermist with Audubon during his expedition to the Upper Missouri in 1843. And Audubon spends about 2.5 months on the Upper Missouri with Bell. Well, the year that a young TR is getting his first shotgun, getting his first glasses, he's given a birthday present by his dad, taxidermy lessons with Audubon's taxidermist. After the expedition, Bell opens a taxidermy shop on Broadway in New York City. And I can only imagine the utter thrill of a young TR going to this taxidermy shop, learning taxidermy from his idol's taxidermist, and then hearing the stories of great game hunts, buffalo hunts, bison hunts on the northern plains. Now we know the exigent reasons for which TR ends up going to North Dakota, death of his wife and mother in the same day, but is the seed planted? Well, through me realizing that science is conducted by Audubon and by Bell and others at Fort Union, I began to realize that there's a huge history associated with Fort Union that we really don't talk about, and it is scientific discovery, and it's not just birds. How many of you know what the state bird of North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana is? Western meadowlark. Who discovers the western meadowlark? Lewis and Clark actually identify a bird that they call the old field lark. It's actually Bell who comes to recognize while he's coming up the Missouri with Audubon that what they're hearing, what they think is similar to the old field lark from the East Coast, is distinct. What's Audubon do? What do Bell do? They take specimens. In the field, they can't determine it's unique. They compare those specimens when they get back east. They do distinguish that they are unique species. Audubon names it Sternella neglecta, neglected starling. The Missouri field lark, common name changes, but it is still scientifically the Sternella neglecta. And what I think is fascinating, and this is a real tangent, but anyway, is during Fiji's and Todd's talk, Mark's and Todd's talk, there was a young lady from the Blackfoot Nation that was talking about, and I think Todd brought this up, names of birds, and immediately I think of the western meadowlark and how naming conventions reflect attitudes. The Blackfeet, as I understand it, recognized the western meadowlark as the bird that warned of danger. So they understood from long association and relationship with that bird its significance, and thus the name is representative of the relationship. And that sort of relationship is something that none of us really have. That requires generations and generations to develop. And it's something that we lack, I think, as a dominant culture. Science wasn't the only thing that Fort Union was important or significant for. I came to discover artwork. We looked at George Catlin's painting. In fact, I rather rapidly bounced over our program painting, the cover of our program booklet. 1833, 1834, Prince Maximilian and Carl Bodmer, Swiss artists, come to the Upper Missouri, spend time at Fort Union, Fort Benton, not Fort Benton, but Fort McKenzie, which predates Fort Benton, producing artwork, not only of landscapes, but portraits of people they encountered. And that artwork is tremendously influential. Ultimately, artwork by people like Audubon, Bodmer, Catlin helped preserve the images of the peoples that are on the Upper Missouri that they're encountering, shows people what the landscape looked like. This artwork, which is exposed in Europe, is ultimately acquired by or used by railroads to entice people to emigrate to the United States and eventually to settle out west. So artwork was tremendously influential, artwork that comes out of Fort Union or is influenced by Fort Union and the fur trade. And the chateaus actually patronized art because that was good publicity. The fur trade didn't necessarily have a good reputation. Good artwork, good publicity, that was recognized by the chateaus, so they sponsored artists. Art also is the reason Fort Union is reconstructed the way it is today and why it is nationally significant as a reconstruction. Despite what Park says, there was enough documentation that the Park Service historians found in journals, business records, artwork. And this is a drawing by another Swiss artist by the name of Rudolf Kurz, who clerked at Fort Union 1851 and 52, kept very detailed journals. This is a perspective looking from the second story of the southwest bastion across the courtyard to the bourgeois house. This is the basis for the reconstruction that we see today. It wasn't the only contribution, though. Again, there was documentary evidence, there was artistic evidence. When Congress finally said, "Thou shalt rebuild Fort Union," the Park Service undertook the largest excavations in the mid-'80s that it had ever undertaken. And these are foundations of the buildings that were found. So this is the bourgeois house right here, two central chimneys. Back here's kitchen, there's dairy. The perspective is from a reconstructed flagpole built in 1985. So literally the reconstruction sits on these foundations. This is the foundation of the Northeast Bastion, which back then there weren't architectural drawings that showed what these looked like. So what did the Park Service archaeologists do? They went to the oldest standing Euro-American building in Montana, the Bastion at Fort Benton, and they looked at how that was constructed. And that informed how Fort Union is ultimately reconstructed. And so here's Fort Union in 1989, year of the grand dedication on the north bank of the Missouri. There's only one building not in this image, which you really can't see, but it's the trade house that sits right up by the main gate. So a little bit of background, some of the common stuff that we understand about why Fort Union's significant. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit was, how does Fort Union still influence our lives today? And why is it nationally significant? What are some of the lesser known stories? Well, we look at what events happened either at Fort Union or like the hub of a wheel. You know, you got your spokes, and you go think back to that image I showed of the sphere of influence. So Fort Union was the center, the hub of a massive sphere of influence. So what's going on within that sphere of influence? Who are the people involved? And then what can we learn largely through archaeology? Now we're familiar with, the trade and the impacts of the trade and the devastation caused by the harvesting of beaver and other animals and the bison, and then the impacts of the trade on native nations. What I wanted to talk about a little bit was some of that, but also look at treaties and tribal relations, intermarriage, governance, sovereignty, and survivance. So again, just a refresher on this map, Fort Union's here, but a massive sphere of influence. I mean, really, Fort Union is the gateway to what becomes Montana. Fort Union exists where it does, not just because of the junctions of the rivers, but because that confluence was a major travel corridor for people since time immemorial. There were major trails on the north bank going in from Blackfoot Territory down to the Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa villages. Massive trade to the south into Crow Territory. So the fur trade didn't blaze new trails. it introduced capitalism, but it capitalized on existing trade networks and patterns and travel corridors. Now, what I want to challenge you to do is look at that map and then look at this one. This is the official map of tribal nations and the territories reserved for nations under the 1851 Horse Creek Treaty or the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. Notice the overlap in the sphere of influence. I like to argue that although the Fort Laramie Treaty occurred at Fort Laramie, which is located just inside the Wyoming border, just west of Nebraska here on the Platte River, just down below Fort Union's sphere of influence. And Fort Laramie did start initially as a trading post, 1834. Sublette and Campbell established it within a couple of years. It's purchased by the American Fur Company, operated by the American Fur Company as Fort William, Fort John, and then commonly called Fort Laramie up until the military purchases it in 1849. And the reason they purchase it, of course, is gold's discovered in California. People are going to the Pacific North, what we now know as the Pacific Northwest. People are afraid of Indian depredations, and so the government's like, we need to provide some security for folks traveling across the California, Mormon, Oregon trails. Okay, how the heck does Fort Union factor into this? Well, the council was convened by David Dawson Mitchell, then Superintendent of Indian Affairs. David Dawson Mitchell had been at Fort Union working as a trader. He has been dispatched. He actually is the gentleman who built Fort McKenzie in 1833 or 34. He served as bourgeois there. By that point, by 1851, again, he's no longer working for the fur trade company, ostensibly. He's working on behalf of Uncle Sam, representing their interests, and he convenes the council. Well, Dawson Mitchell back in St. Louis, he's got a lot of friends and contacts with the fur trade. He knows Jesuit missionary Pierre de Smet, one of Dawson Mitchell's former colleagues, Alexander Culbertson, who was bourgeois of Fort Union, establisher of, he worked at Mackenzie, and then Mackenzie's destroyed in the mid-1840s. Culbertson, who had married a Blackfoot woman by the name of Nailoista, or Snake Medicine Woman, or Medicine Snake Woman, I think I've heard it both ways. They established Fort Lewis, which in short order then is reestablished as Fort Benton. So they're the founders of Montana, as we know it today, one could say. Anyway, David Dawson Mitchell asks Alexander Culbertson and de Smet to notify all of the tribes on the Upper Plains as they're going upriver on the steamship to let them know of this council down at Fort Laramie, and then to bring them down to that council. Representatives of the Arikara, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Assiniboine meet at Fort Union with Culbertson and de Smet. Then they travel overland down portions of what become the Bozeman Trail, which again was a well-established Native American travel route. They convene at Fort Union or Fort Laramie, participate in the Treaty Council, which had to be moved 10 miles, 20, 30 miles actually east of Fort Laramie, just because there were so many people, over 10,000 gathered, lots of horses, they ate up all the grass. And under that council, then there's territories that are reserved. And again, the territories that are reserved for the different nations are shown here. So Assiniboine, MHA, Lakota, I forget which one is Cheyennes, Crow. Even though the Blackfeet weren't actually present at the council, when I was reading through Indian Claims Commission interviews, oral history interviews from the 1920s from the Assiniboine, I did find reference to two women accompanying DeSmet, Culbertson, and the representatives of the tribe, and I suspect it was not Oista. And there is speculation that she had enough influence that she was able to convince treaty commissioners and DeSmet to reserve territory for the Blackfeet under 1851 treaty. And again, these are pictures of some of the people. Again, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Culbertson, not Oista, their youngest son, Joe. And then this is Robert Meldrum, who is the AFC's principal trader in Crow Country. He brought the Crow delegation down to the Treaty Commission or Treaty Council at Fort Laramie. And these two are still working for the American Fur Company. And what this is illustrating is the close collusion between business and governance. In many ways, especially Culbertson, but also in different respects, Mitchell and Meldrum, they're serving as proxy representatives for the federal government. So they're, serving two masters. Culbertson serves as like the interpreter for the Assiniboine. After the 1851 Treaty Council, what you have here is an illustration by the artist John McStanley. And Stanley was accompanying Governor Isaac Stevens of Washington Territory. He was the artist assigned to the northernmost of the Transcontinental Railroad surveys that Stevens was leading. And this is an illustration from Stevens' report to Congress showing the annuities distribution, the first annuities distribution after 1851 for the Assiniboine at Fort Union. So again, Fort Union becomes an outpost of the federal government. Indian agents would use Fort Union. It would be a meeting place with tribal nations. It would be a place for annuities distribution. In fact, after the delegates returned from Fort Laramie in 1851, October 1851, annuity goods weren't coming. Government started too late and weren't able to, didn't start too late. The council was so late in the year, they weren't able to get annuity goods purchased and delivered. So Culbertson actually, on behalf of the government, works with his employer to get the trading company to supply the annuity goods for distribution in 1851. And those goods are distributed inside the fort. Because I am running short on time, I'm going to speed up a little bit. 1851 isn't the only treaty that's associated with Fort Union or peoples associated with Fort Union. Because of the desire to open the Northern Plains to settlement, to allow for the construction of posts, roads, trains, Stevens wants to host or hold a council with the Blackfeet. Well, in 1853, he needs funding. He delegates Culbertson to go back and lobby Congress to get the funding for what becomes known as the Blackfoot Council on the Judith River, which does open that territory. And one thing that's interesting in this, before the council, is Stevens would write in his report that Nottowista, so Culbertson had a brother that went to West Point. So Stevens knew the brother. And so when Stevens comes to the upper Missouri, he asked Culbertson to go with him. Well, he didn't ask Nottowista. Nottowista's like, you two idiots are going to piss off my relatives, and so you're going to get each other killed. I'm going with you. What Stevens writes in his report is, in 1853, Nottowista would set up her encampment between the U.S. military and the Blackfeet delegation, and the women would gather around her tent and in her tent, and they'd be telling stories and laughing and having a good old time, poking fun at all the white people. Anyway, I do have to wrap up here. We'll hear a lot more about this council in the next 2 sessions tomorrow, so I won't talk about that. Again, people like Notoista and Culbertson, this is Edwin Denig, his successor at Fort Union, and his wife, Dear Little Woman. His brother-in-law actually represents the Assiniboine at the 1851 Treaty Council. John Ewers, the Smithsonian ethnologist, has argued that, and convincingly, that the marriage between Notoista and Alexander laid the groundwork for 150 years of Blackfoot leadership. Her brother ends up being seen from afar, ends up being a major leader. Another one is James Kipp, the individual who establishes originally Fort Pegan, that's replaced by Fort McKenzie and then Fort Benton. Kipp marries actually Good Woman, the daughter of forebears of the Mandan. Well, when Kipp, which was not uncommon for traders, have the custom of the country marriage with a native woman, they retire, leave, abandon their Native American wife and children, go back and live with their wives back in civilization. Well, Good Earth and Joseph Kipp end up going to Fort Benton, becoming very prominent in the history of that region. And indeed, to this day, there's Kipp serving on the Blackfoot Tribal Council. The Culbertsons, actually, their descendants, the descendants of Joe, serve on the Assiniboine and Sioux Tribal Council into the 70s and 80s. And just the last surnamed tribal leader of the Culbertsons passed away just a couple of years ago. So again, tribal governance is being structured by, influenced by, determined by individuals involved in the fur trade. And this is something that we don't really talk about and recognize. And with that, we've all experienced COVID. A lot of the changes that occurred on the upper Missouri are as a consequence of smallpox, which I think COVID and our experience with COVID really give us some insights into maybe some of the traumas that resulted and the loss of culture. And with that, the last thing I'll end with is, although Fort Union was gone by 1869, it was still, the confluence was still a prominent site. And so as a result of the smallpox, the MHA Nation coalesced, survivors coalesced, came together to survive from, attacks by the Lakota and just hostility from the Lakota. And a dissident band from 1869 to 1884 resided at the Fort Union site. It's within the boundaries of the park today. And as a result of that, and I won't expect you to read it, but MHA ceremonies, songs, dances, local knowledge of plants. The MHA today say the Hushka Village site was responsible for preserving many of their traditions, which they would have lost. And so, again, Fort Union, huge sphere of influence. And I want to thank you for your time, and sorry for cutting into your time a little bit.